Hi, I'm Vic Bearcroft. Today I'm going to show you how to paint a panda in acrylic. Before we start, let's have a look at a few simple compositional rules. Now what I've done is I've taken my original reference photograph and just traced a quick outline over there. To begin with, let's bring our panda, our subject, over to the left-hand side of the paper. Now obviously for me this doesn't work at all because we have the panda's arms, he's pointing to the left, and nothing is working at all. Let's move him more towards the centre. It doesn't do an awful lot for me because the eye is led in from both sides in equal distance and there's nowhere else to look. Let's move him now over to the right hand side of the paper in that top corner, and there's a lot of space on the left hand side where his arms are pointing, so your eye should be led in from the left hand side, go up diagonally towards the panda's head and circle back round where the mountains will be. And this will also give us a feeling of height because the panda itself is placed high up in the painting, and also depth because we've got a lot of space in which we can add distant mountains and trees. Okay, so now my panda is set in position. I'm now going to take the tracing paper off and sketch in the more subtle details. Okay, so now we're ready to start painting the picture. What I'm going to do first, because there are mainly cool colours in this painting, is to warm the whole environment by a backwash of burnt sienna. For this I'm going to use a 2-inch decorating brush so I can cover the whole painting fairly quickly. Let's make the wash, a little touch of burnt sienna. It doesn't want to be too strong, of course. That colour is going to show through in patches here and there. So I think we're ready to go. Another thing this does with acrylics is to seal the pencil sketch underneath, toning the background and sealing your drawing underneath. So make sure it's nice and even, and then we can just wait for that to dry before we continue. Okay, the next step is to put a couple of glazes over the sky. For this I'm going to use ultramarine blue. Remember, I do want a little bit of the warmth to show through from the burnt sienna wash. So I'm going to use the 1/2-inch flat brush. Acrylic paint does dry fairly quickly, and if you don't keep it moving you will get watermarks where one section is dry and another section is still a little bit wet. So work as quickly as you can. That's all covered, so we'll wait for that to dry and then we'll do a second layer over that. Okay, so now the sky is dry, 2 layers of ultramarine blue. What we're going to do next is just glaze over the distant mountains. So this is going to be in 2 sections. First of all, the distant mountain range here, which is going to be a single wash of Prussian blue, and then the range just in front of that, which will have a little bit of burnt sienna added to it to make it warmer, to bring it slightly more forward. So we'll start with the smallest area, the very distant mountains, just a light wash of Prussian blue. So just over this section here, very, very faint. Just want to create an illusion of shape of that mountain, which is a slightly different tone from the sky, of course, and that very light Prussian blue will knock it right back into the distance. The mountain range in front of that, make it a little bit warmer with just a touch of burnt sienna in the Prussian blue. That will bring it a little bit more forward from the mountain range behind it. So it doesn't matter that you don't have to wait for this to dry, of course, because you're working in a separate area. Maybe just a touch more blue in that, that's better. And I still want to keep it quite flat because at that distance you won't see too much detail in it. We'll save the detail for the mountains in the foreground. And then just a little bit this side of the tree. Down to about here. We'll let that settle before we do the mountain ranges in the foreground. These will all, of course, fade back once we start painting more detail in the tree and the panda, and they'll take their rightful place, which is in the distance. Okay, so now we're ready to do the foreground hills. Obviously the one in the corner here is much closer than the one here, so we can treat them both the same to start with. We'll have a slightly thicker solution of the Prussian blue with a touch of burnt sienna, make it nice and warm, almost a greeny colour to begin with. We want it to be slightly heavier to bring those forward. As a result of aerial perspective, anything that's in the distance will appear paler and cooler, of course. So let's check that. We'll start off with this mountain range just here, and again create a bit of a textured edge to it. That's down the side of the tree, making some downward strokes with the brush because the streaks are actually going downwards, representing the texture and the shape of the mountain. So that's our mid-distance mountain. We're going to use the same colour for the foreground mountain, except this time we're going to change the texture a little bit. So I want to start creating the impression of maybe some visible forest in the mountain closest to us that we can see. So we can begin by using the blade of the flat brush to suggest a tree line on the top of the mountain, and again fill in below using the same or similar vertical strokes. That'll give an impression of a forested mountain without actually having to paint too many trees. And then we'll leave that to dry before we put a little bit more texture in there. Okay, so for the final bit of the background, we're going to paint some more texture on the foreground mountain, again with the Prussian blue burnt sienna mix, a little bit darker, and this time I've added a little bit of chromium oxide green just to get a greener feel to it. Using the blade of the flat brush again, creating darker tree texture, so you can make some little hills in and around that mountain. We're not after covering the whole of the green that we put down already. Some of that showing through will give us additional tones and textures. Okay, so now our background is dry, we're going to start to underpaint the tree and the panda. Underpainting simply means laying down some basic texture and colour before we put some finer details and highlights over the top. To begin with, I'm going to start underpainting the tree. And for this I'm going to use burnt umber. So reasonably thick, almost like the consistency of single cream, I guess. So not a glaze, but not totally thick either. So we'll try this. And what I want to do is to start to create a little bit of texture in the tree by leaving some gaps here and there. What I also need to consider is the light is coming from the top right of the painting. So some of the branches on the right hand side I want to leave for the moment. Let's try this for texture. We'll start off in the part of the branch there. That's fine. So I'll start to create the outline of the tree quite carefully because we don't want it to invade the background too much at this stage. And just use the blade of the flat brush to help create sharp edges and a little bit of texture. So we want to reasonably carefully avoid painting over the panda's legs and paws at this stage. Think about the texture of the tree. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as your reference. The reference I'm using does have the tree in it, of course, but I'm not following that reference picture necessarily. Okay, so now that first layer of the underpainting is dried, I'm going to use another colour over the top of that, which is ultramarine blue. So this will help darken the burnt umber that we've already got on, and also to create some cool highlights on the right-hand side of the branches where the light source is. It's not going to be the single cream consistency we had with the burnt umber. It's more a glaze or a wash. But we'll check it first. Yeah, that looks light enough to me. I don't want it to be too strong because otherwise the light parts of the tree will look too blue. Simply continue the process all around the tree. Now while we've got the ultramarine blue, what I want to do, and we don't have to wait for that to dry, I wanted to use the same colour on the dark fur in the panda. Of course I know it's black fur, but in daylight, especially light like this, a cool light, the black fur will shine a blue tinge. So we'll start with his paw and just give a solid colour over the whole leg. Anywhere on the panda that appears to be black, we'll paint it blue to begin with. This one, just switch to a finer brush, number 6 brush, to work the blue areas in his face. Exactly the same procedure, so we've got his ear on that side, which is black of course, a wee bit more, ear on that side. Those all-important patches around his eyes, very carefully sketch the shape in, and you can start to see his features appear already. The nose, and while that's still wet, we'll just dry the brush off a little bit and soften the edges of that shadow underneath his nose in the muzzle. You can see tones a lot easier if you screw your eyes up and squint at it rather than being sat too close with it for too long. We'll wait for that to dry before we do the second part of the underpainting of the panda, which is in the white fur. And basically what I'm going to do is do an underpainting of yellow ochre over the white fur, because white fur on most animals is never pure white. It always has a tinge of, in this case, a nice sort of warm background tone of yellow ochre will be quite warm enough. So we'll start with his back end, not too strong, that should be okay actually, yeah, so we'll leave it like that. So again, don't have to worry about being too neat with this, it's only a background colour, background tone. And the same on his head. Try to avoid going too much over the blue areas you've got already, otherwise you'll get a greenish look to it. What I'm going to start to do next is to create some further texture in the tree. For this I'm going to use Payne's Grey, and remembering our shadow side is going to be on the left. Just let the point of view brush dance around the tree here and there. We're not here to paint an exact replica of this tree, it'll take you forever. The main subject of the painting, of course, is the panda, which will go well with your highlights of ultramarine blue that we've already set. Okay, so now our texture is dry. We can use the same colour, Payne's Grey, a little bit thinner, because we want this to be a glaze for the shadow areas. So it needs to be slightly transparent. Again, just glaze, and then we can prepare for the final texturizing of the tree. Okay, so now our initial texturizing has dried, which is the Payne's Grey. And we're going to put a little bit more texture to make the tree look a little bit thicker. For this we're going to use undiluted burnt sienna, and then what we're going to do is two things. First of all, we're going to put a little bit of the texture on straight from the brush. This will give the branches of the tree and the tree bark a nice warm feel to it. But before that dries completely, just take a clean finger and wipe it with the end of your finger, and that will give a little bit more drag on there, and it helps to create that woody, barky texture. Work our way all the way around the tree, following the pattern of your Payne's Grey texturizing, and then once that's dry, then we'll be ready to move on to the main part of the painting, which is the panda, of course.